All right, I'm gonna start with the introduction, knowing that it'll take not too long, but a little for people to keep coming on. And we're all coming on tonight to have a conversation with Professor Elliot Dorff, which is a great treat for me. I was Professor Dorff's student, philosophy at then University of Judaism, now American Jewish University, and the Ziegler School. As I prepared for tonight, I see, Professor Dorff, that it is your 50th year
Yes,
celebration from graduation from JTS.
that's correct.
And it took you only 1 year to get your PhD from Columbia.
Well,
but, but that's to say, while in rabbinical school, you were clearly studying for your doctorate in
that's right.
philosophy as well. And it's remarkable that you were able to do two at once. And upon graduation, came directly to Los Angeles, to the UJ,
Right.
then the UJ, where you have been a professor, a rector, a dean, and a teacher of philosophy, active in the community of Los Angeles through the Jewish Family Service, through interfaith dialogue, having taught in addition to AJU, having taught at JTS, but having taught for many years at the UCLA Law School, having co-authored a couple of books with your co-teacher at UCLA on religion and law, and have, in regard to UCLA, also served on the Ethics Advisory Board for the UCLA Medical Center. And so you have all those different kinds of high thinking roles. But in addition, you've been a president of the Jewish Family Service of Los Angeles, which is high thinking. But I would say that's also caregiving in a more direct way and being involved with thinking and feeling what families are going through. And so tonight in our conversation, we are limited in time. Each of those topics would be worthy of more than an hour. And we're going to divide our conversation, you and me, to about a half hour on three topics. And that's COVID and medicine, COVID and Jewish ethics, and you're the chair of the community, the CJLS, the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, which helps rabbis determine Jewish law for their communities. And then last, we'll talk about some of the interpersonal challenges that come with COVID land. So the first is the most theoretical on some level, and I know you have written responsa, which are legal Jewish papers on triage, both in the past and in response to this moment. What are, in preparation, you mentioned that the committee at UCLA, which used to meet once a month, is now meeting once a week.
Right.
Who's on that committee? Just to give us an orientation, what kind of people are grappling with COVID and medical ethics?
Okay, so the ethics committee at UCLA Medical Center consists of a number of physicians who come from a variety of different areas of specialty. The chair of the committee is Dr. Neil Wenger, who's an internist and who has done a lot of work on outcome research, and is a former Hebrew High student of mine, by the way, a long, long time ago. And there are a couple of nurses. There's a clinical social worker, and then there's several community members. I'm officially a community member on that. So the committee consists of about 30 people.
Wow.
And literally this afternoon from 4 to 6, we had yet another meeting about the triage policy at UCLA, if it should become necessary. At the moment at UCLA, it has not been necessary because there have been enough resources, both ventilators and other kinds of machines, as well as hospital staff, to deal with all of the people that have come in, not just for COVID, but for other things as well. However, there are other hospitals in Los Angeles where that's not true. And one of the things we talked about is what happens, does UCLA take some of the overage? Does it offer to take some of the overage? And part of the, I mean, we had several meetings back in, well, late March and April, in which we thought we had come up with our triage policy. And then we had a really interesting meeting with three African-American women who are physicians, and who were pointing out that, you know, if the policy that we had adopted were to be carried out, and the policy basically tries to save as many lives as possible. That's the idea. And so in terms of triage, if you're, what you want to do is use the resources that you have to save the people that are most likely to be able to survive to hospital discharge, right? You don't know what's going to happen thereafter, because nobody knows exactly how long they're going to live or whatever, right? But to hospital discharge, you can sort of predict that they would be appropriate for hospital discharge. And we specifically put in, you know, without reference to race, to age, to ability to pay, to gender, any of those things, right? But then these physicians, these African-American physicians, or now I guess you're supposed to now say black again, say that, you know, said, but you need to understand that there is institutional racism in our country, and that if you're going to discount in terms of their triage rating people with pre-existing conditions, then you are automatically going to prefer whites over blacks, and Latinos too, but especially blacks, because blacks basically largely come from the lower socioeconomic classes of society, therefore are more likely to have food that is not all that nutritious, more likely to, more likely to have diabetes, more likely to be overweight, more likely to smoke, all of those kinds of things, right? So then the question becomes, well, so what do you do with the policy? I mean, and this past, the 2 hours from 4 to 6 were primarily about just simply a straight lottery, basically first come, first serve, or, you know, you get all of the people that come on a given day, you put their names in a hat and you just pick, regardless of whether they have a chance of making it to a hospital discharge, or do you have some kind of process in which you prefer those that you're more likely to save on the moral ground that it's a utilitarian ground, but on the moral ground that you want to save as many lives as possible, right?
And in that conversation, as a scholar of Jewish text, what would Jewish text have to inform that decision?
Okay, so in the midst of all of this, over the last several months, I also, I'm chair of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, and I've written a number of true vote, rabbinic rulings on biomedical issues. I actually have a book called Matters of Life and Death on Jewish bioethics. And the last chapter of it, this is long before COVID, the book came out in 1998. The last chapter of it talks about the distribution of healthcare, who gets it and who pays for it. And you need to understand that so I wrote the short answer to your question is I wrote a rabbinic ruling on triage. And the interesting thing is that until very recently in human history, medical care was both ineffective, largely for cure, and therefore cheap, right? So literally until the 20th century, there was very little that medicine could do for you to cure you. There was a very good preventive medicine. I mean, going back to Leviticus 13 and 14, using quarantine in order to try to contain a virus like this, or contain some kind of communicable disease. So that's already in the Torah. And the rabbis knew that you should eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, not too much meat, that you should get exercise. The rabbis knew all of those things, right? So preventive care was pretty good, but curative care was terrible. The only two things they could do was they thought that, and they were right, that many diseases are bloodborne. So they thought that if you could take a pint of blood from somebody, that might cure the disease. It turns out that the only disease it cures is one that my mother had, polycythemia, too many red blood corpuscles. where to this day, the way that you treat that is you take a pint of blood every once in a while, right? But otherwise it treats nothing. And the other thing they would do is surgery, but if they did surgery. I mean, you may have seen Dances with Wolves, the movie that got the award for the best picture in 1990. It takes place during the American Civil War, and at the beginning of it, Kevin Costner, who's the primary character, person is a soldier and he has a leg injury, and he's taken to sick bay, and they showed them what was really medical care at the time during the Civil War. You got the person drunk, that was anesthesia, right? You held them down and you sawed. And if the person didn't die of the operation, bleeding out, the person would die of infection. So Kevin Costner runs away, and then the rest of the movie happens. Okay, but it was only around the time of the Civil War that a man by the name of Lister figured out that if physicians washed their hands between procedures, fewer people died. And hence Listerine, named after him, right? But that's the 1860s. And it wasn't until we got the sulfa drugs in the 1920s, roughly, and then penicillin discovered in 1928. But it wasn't. They didn't know how to make a lot of it until the early 1940s, when President Roosevelt brought together the heads of pharmaceutical companies and said, "I need a lot of doses of penicillin fast." Right, and that's when that became possible, and that's really important in terms of saving people's lives. But until then, medicine couldn't do that. So if you look at our tradition for resources on how do you triage scarce things, so there are two kinds of incidents in which our ancestors faced that. One was in regard to poverty. The Jewish community was not rich. It was, if anything, poor. And the question was, how does a poor community help the destitute? Yes, there were the Rothschilds, and there was Donna Garcia, a woman who largely sponsored the Spanish Jews who were fleeing Spain after the expulsion in 1492 to get to Turkey. So there were a few rich Jews along the way, but by and large, our community was a poor community, and needed to figure out whom to help among the poor and how much to help. And then the other issue was captivity, because Jews were, especially in Christian countries, were not allowed to do what was considered to be honorific, that is agricultural work in the land. Jews were forced to work in trade, import-export kinds of things, and in banking and the like. And that meant that Jews were vulnerable to being taken captive on the high seas and also on the highways, right? And so then the question is, well, how much is the community going to pay to ransom captives who were literally at risk of their lives, as well as being raped and things in that order, right? On the one hand, you want to save them, right? We have to save them from these kinds of results. But on the other hand, if you spend a lot of money, then captors are going to figure out that the Jews will spend a lot of money to redeem their captives, and therefore will take more Jews into captivity. By the way, this is exactly what Israel has been facing in terms of what's his name, Gilad.
Shalit.
Pardon me?
Gilad Shalit.
Gilad Shalit. That's right. Yes, that's right. And others, right? And it's a real question as to how exactly how Israel should respond to its soldiers being taken captive. So anyway, there are sources that deal with that, and those are the sources that I deal with in chapter 12 of Matters of Life and Death, and then apply them to modern medical situations. And not surprisingly, there are several different ways you could go, using different kinds of medical sources, Jewish sources, in order to try to figure out whom do you save first, and at what cost, and who pays it. So anyway, I wrote this rabbinic ruling on triage, and Rabbi Daniel Nevins, another member of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, wrote another one, and we had this wonderful chavruta, this back and forth. He lives in New York, I live in Los Angeles, for about a month. We started out very far apart, and then ended up with the same conclusion, but using different sources and interpreting them differently.
And as a thumbnail, what's the conclusion?
So the conclusion is that that you do indeed want pikuach nefesh. You do indeed want to save as many lives as possible. But on the other hand, if somebody is already on a ventilator, let's say, you may not remove that person from a ventilator unless that person really is, unless continuing on the ventilator is really futile. In other words, that there's no hope whatsoever that this person on the ventilator is going to recover to hospital discharge. And so a lot of our conversation is, what does it mean to be futile and all of that, right? And another part of it had to do with again, how do you choose? Let's say you have several people, all of whom are more or less in the same medical condition, and all of whom need this one ventilator, right? How do you choose among them? Is it first come, first serve, or is it a lottery? I argued for a lottery because of the conversation that I had heard about, with these three black physicians, because first come, first serve will usually mean it'll be people who have better access to healthcare. That will be their first, namely whites, right? So if you do it instead on the basis of what their presenting cases are, it still doesn't completely diminish the amount of structural racism in the whole process, right? But at least it's not who happens to get there first. So anyway, that's one of the places where we disagreed, and we ended up agreeing on a number of things, but using different sources, interpreting differently. By the way, they're on the website of the Rabbinical Assembly. It's open to anybody. Just Google Rabbinical Assembly, then the tab Jewish Law, then Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. If you forget all of this, Rabbi Spitz will tell you how to do it, right? And then this comes under Orach Chaim, and you can see both Rabbi Nevin's tshuva and mine. You can see how we dealt with that.
Now that's a good segue to the next topic, and that is, as the chair of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, COVID has raised the issues of Shabbat and technology. I'd like you to talk about it, and I'm keeping one eye on the clock, which means our time again is limited. So I'm going to ask it in a different way. I'm going to ask you to tell me the bottom line, but if I'm going to frame it as I've heard some ask me as a rabbi, if this allows us to connect with each other in this time, why is there any tension at all? Meaning, okay, why shouldn't it just be green light?
All right. Well, let me answer the question as you asked it, and then it gets more complicated. The issues in regard to using technology on Shabbat are several. Number one is the status of electricity. Do you use electricity on Shabbat altogether, right? And Rabbi Daniel Nevins wrote a wonderful tshuva pointing out that you should be allowed to use electricity on Shabbat. But as most of you will know, our Orthodox co-religionists will not use electricity on Shabbat for a series of reasons. And so you need to sort of work that out. But assume you're using electricity on Shabbat. The next issue has to do with writing, because especially if it's being recorded, or if you have to type in to get into a link of some sort or another, right, on Shabbat, does that violate the prohibition in our tradition of writing on Shabbat? And you can go in several different directions there. Because I mean, in antiquity, the rabbis interpreted writing as meaning that you wrote two letters that you could see with the native eye, right? But clearly, when you're typing, especially when you let's say you simply press on a link, you don't know what's going on. At least let me say, I don't know what's going on. Maybe people who are more technologically savvy than I know what's going on. But if it creates a record, if it creates a permanent record, then one might say, even if you can't see the various machinations that are allowing you to link in, it is effectively writing. So that's the second piece of it. A third piece of it is not so much, Shamor Yom HaShabbat. It's not so much that the fourth of the 10 Commandments appears in two different places. In Exodus, it's Zachor Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath day, and in Deuteronomy, it's observe the Sabbath day. So the problem here is we use our computers, a lot of us, for work. And so simply being able to shut them down on Friday afternoon and not look at them throughout Shabbat, right, is really a liberating experience. It is really, the word lishbot means to cease. It stops the treadmill. As a matter of fact, there's a wonderful organization called Reboot. And if you just simply Google them and sign up, they will send you a little burlap bag that you can put your iPhone in on Friday afternoon and tie it up. So you're not enslaved to it over Shabbat, right? So I mean, part of the issue here is, are you going to use this? Are you going to stare at the screen on Shabbat as well as through the other 6 days of the week? Or is this going to be something different? Now, arguing on the other side, right, is that, well, what happens if you cannot come together, right? And there was a rabbinic ruling by Rabbi Avram Reisner in the early 2000s, long before COVID, in which he was dealing with people who were either bedridden or live in a very rural area and cannot be part of a minyan. And so the question was, can those people become part of a minyan by, at that time, calling in? This is before Zoom and all of that, right? And his tshuva was called "Wired to the Kadosh Baruch Hu," right? Wired to God. Can you do that? And he basically said you can only do that if there's really 10 adult Jews in a room together, constituting a minyan, and then people calling in can be part of it, right? So now the question is, well, we can't have that in most places where you have 10 adult Jews in the same room together. So can you constitute a minyan simply on Zoom, especially in Zoom because you now can see each other, right, as well as hear each other? And even he would say, he had said that during this pandemic, which is an emergency situation, you can certainly constitute a minyan during the rest of the week, other than Shabbat, right, this way. Although I must say a number of conservative rabbis don't think so. So let me just say, some conservative rabbis think there's no minyan there altogether. Some say there's no minyan for most things, but what people really care about is mourner's Kaddish. So for mourner's Kaddish, we'll call it a day. We'll call it a minyan for mourner's Kaddish for nothing else. And some conservative rabbis have said it's a minyan for all purposes. Okay? This is all within our movement, okay? If Jews, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, all the more so 2 rabbis, 3 opinions, right? So it's so those are the issues in terms of just zooming for making up a yes. I must say that one of the things that people have seen is that classes that rabbis and others offer are often much better attended on Zoom than they were in person, because you don't have to go anywhere, you don't have to deal with traffic, and you just click on your computer and you're in the class. And when it's over, you don't have to drive home either. You're right there, right? So a lot of rabbis are finding that classes are much better attended this way than the other way. But on the other hand, you lose things when you're not together, right? And we certainly are. I teach at the American Jewish University. We were just told that we simply cannot open for in-person classes because of the resurrection of the pandemic. And so all of our classes are going to be online. And that's, of course, what we were doing from mid-March until the end of the semester as well. It's just not the same. I mean, what can I tell you? You know what it reminds me of a little bit? Not the Israeli, well, even before this, the state, Chaim Nachman Bialik, said that, yes, you can do Judaism, through a translation, but it's like kissing your lover through a veil, right? So in the same sort of a way, right, doing services online and doing everything online is just doesn't taste the same. I'll just leave it at that. Okay.
Well, there's more to be said, obviously, about these challenges and your guidance of Shabbat and the sanctity of time set apart in technology. But I want to move to the third topic and then have people have opportunities to engage. And the third topic is COVID at home, where we are quarantined. And I have 2 questions in that regard. The first one you raised in our preparation for this conversation And you said that there's the challenge of people who are both alone, and there's the challenge of those who are sequestered with their families 24/7.
Right.
So, as Rabbi Dorff, what do you have to say pastorally?
Okay, fair enough. Well, let me step back just one step, and you'll understand what I'm after here. The Jewish tradition was really very different from both the Western philosophical tradition and the Christian tradition on the relationship between body and between our bodies and our inner being. This goes back to Plato, who made a sharp distinction between body and mind. The body is the animal in you, the mind is the distinctly human in you, and through the rest of Western thought, you have the mind-body problem. Where are they connected? Descartes thought they were connected in the pineal gland. Now you have people using MRI machines to try to figure out, vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. When do you make that decision? What's going on in your mind when you do it? By the way, the answer is none of the above, mint chocolate chip. But anyway, right. So that's in the Western philosophical tradition. In the Christian tradition, again, the body is the animal in you, the soul is the divine in you. So among Catholics, for example, the ideal person is the one who suppresses the body as much as possible in order to cultivate the mind. The priest, the nun, the monk. In the Jewish tradition, there's a very strong sense that body, mind, emotions, will are all connected within us. The Talmud tells a story that the man had an orchard. He leaves it in the control of a blind man and a lame man, and it says to them, "Don't eat of any of the fruit of the orchard." As soon as he leaves, the blind man says, "This is easy. I'll put you on my shoulders. We'll eat of the fruit of the orchard." He'll never figure out how we did it. So that's what they do. He comes back and he sees that some of the fruit of the orchard is missing, and he says, "I thought I told you not to eat it." And the blind man says, "I couldn't possibly do it. I can't see where it is." And the lame man says, "I couldn't possibly do it. I can see where it is, but I can't get there." So the owner takes the lame man, puts him on the shoulders of the blind man, and says, "This is how you did it. This is how you'll be judged." Similarly, says the Talmud, the body says, "I can't lead a person to sin because without the neshama, the life breath within me, I'm like an inert stone. And just as a stone cannot do anything, I cannot be held responsible." And the neshama, the life breath, says, "I can't be responsible for a person sinning because without the body, I'm like an ethereal bird flying in the air with no substance." So God takes the neshama, throws it, that's literally the Talmud's word, into the body and says, "This is how you were created and this is how you'll be judged." Now, it's a simple story, but it flies in the face of all of Western thought and all of Christian thought. And what it says is that all of these things are connected within us. And as a result, the way you treat your body is going to affect how you think about yourself, how you feel about yourself, and what you do. And vice versa, how you think and feel about yourself will affect how you treat your body. This goes back to, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel gave a talk to the American Medical Association in the mid-60s, "The Patient as Person," where what he was trying to show was that doctors should not think about people as simply machines that are broken down. These are people with histories, people with families, and all of that. Now, what does that mean? That means that in the Jewish tradition, not only is physical health taken very seriously, and you have a whole slew of rabbis during the Middle Ages who are also physicians. Maimonides is probably the most famous, but there's a whole list of them, right? Doesn't happen that much anymore because it still takes more or less the same amount of time to go through rabbinical school, but it takes much, much longer to go through medical school. I was at a conference one time at the University of Virginia Medical School, and the dean said, in Mr. Jefferson's medical school, it took 1 year to become a doctor. So there are not a lot of MD rabbis these days, but there are some. But what it means is that in addition to taking care of our physical beings, and that means that we do need to get exercise. Somebody told me COVID-19, the 19 is for the 19 pounds I've gained since the pandemic broke out, right? You do need to take care of your physical being, but you also need to take care of your emotional, your psychological being. And it's at least as important, and it's very complicated. First of all, if you're talking about people who are alone, Genesis chapter 2, it's not good for a person to live alone, right? We are social beings. And if you have any doubt about that, just think about the prison environment. Short of execution and torture, the harshest penalty is solitary confinement. And we unfortunately have a lot of evidence of people who are held in solitary confinement for long periods of time. Many of them go insane. We really do need to be with other people. Or I'll quote you another ancient Jewish source. People who need people are the luckiest people in the world. Just kidding, obviously, right? But we really do need to be connected to other people. Yes, we all need some time alone, but we also need to be connected to other people. But on the other hand, right, if you're stuck with the people you know and love, your family, 24/7, that can be, well, that can lead to a lot of tension. It can lead to, frankly, to an increased rate of family violence. One of the things that Jewish Family Service does in Los Angeles is that it runs free shelters for battered women and children. And unfortunately, we're hearing a lot more. We're hearing a lot more of that now. So it's really important to, it's important, first of all, to tell the members of your family that you love them, because God forbid you are infected in this disease and you die of this disease. You don't want to die without telling your family that you love them, and say it many, many times, right? On the other hand, when they really annoy you, right, you've got to figure out ways in which you can deal with each other in a way that is not violent, and in a way that does preserve a sense of being together as a family, but also a sense of being an individual uniquely yourself. And you need to be able to do that. By all means, use the technology that's available for things that you never even thought of before. A little ad here, American Jewish University, where I work, runs this whole Bayachad program. You know, a lot of webinars for people to be interested in all kinds of things that you never heard of before, and some that you have. So you may want to look that up. It's just something to get, just something to do, something different to do. But you need to find a way to balance all of that, and that's not always easy.
So the last question, and if people would like, I'd ask that you ask questions in the Q&A that you have, and then I'll harvest some of those for Rabbi Dorff. Before, I don't want to forget, just a couple shout outs before this last question, and that's from, I'm noting, B. Levin, who worked with you for so many years at AJU.
Hi, B.
Mother of congregants. I want to acknowledge Rabbi Steve Einstein, who celebrates your helping found the Sandra Kaplan Beit Din, which is multi-denominational coming together to invite and celebrate new Jews to our community.
Right.
And since you're now for the first time in a cosmic background space,
I want to thank Gail Geffen.
The last of the shout outs is that it was Gail Geffen who told you and me how to do it. And she was a former student of Marlin's at the BJE, studying with her at BJE. So she asked that you convey that to Marlin, that she's your teacher of technology. So with that, some questions. The first one that I see is Rochelle Ambersoud. And what Rochelle asks is regarding the first topic, that of triage. Mm-hmm. To what degree should the dependence of others on a patient come into account in prioritizing who gets a ventilator?
Right. I wish you had been part of the UCLA discussion between 4 and 6, because that was about a third of it, right? Namely, should people who have dependents, should they be prioritized because those dependents depend upon these people? That could be, young parents with an infant or a toddler, right? It could be older people who are taking care of their elderly parents. It could be all kinds of people have dependents, right? So part of the problem with using that in the triage formula is that all kinds of people have dependents, and remember, these triage decisions are being made very quickly. And how much time do you have to weigh? Well, whose dependence take precedence over who's dependence, right? So, I mean, should it be, let's say, a single mom who has, let's say, a 5-year-old, but now she's infected? Should she take precedence over, let's say, a 60-year-old who's taking care of a 90-year-old mother, right? So so as soon as you start dealing with this, it gets very, very murky very fast. Another piece of this, just to give you another, some more of the, what shall I say, the complications of this all, has to do with age. So on the one hand, you don't want ageism, right? But I mean, should you, and a very prominent bioethicist, Zeke Emanuel, whom I know personally, has argued that really we shouldn't be interested in saving numbers of lives. We should be saving life years. So, and why should that happen? Because people like me, I'm 77, have had the opportunity to live a full life. And so shouldn't somebody in their, let's say, teens or 20s, have that opportunity over me, right? So that's another thing that's out there in terms of, the questions of how do you triage. It's a very, and then, by the way, recently, what about people who have completely ignored and actually defied what the medical people are telling us to do? So people who go, this is especially young people, who go partying without masks, without social distance, all of that, and then it turns out that a lot of them have COVID. That certainly was true on the beaches of California and of Florida over the Memorial Day weekend and over the July 4th weekend, and hence spikes in both of those places. So if those people show up and they have defied all medical advice up to this point, should they be triaged down, right? In other words, should you prefer people who took this seriously and despite that, they were wearing masks anytime they were in public, and they tried to social distance, and despite that they were infected? Shouldn't those people who are responsible take precedence over people who are not, right? So you can see how complicated this is right from the beginning. Some are arguing you shouldn't triage at all. You just do a lottery, whoever, or you first come first serve, and that's the end of the matter. Because as soon as you start taking into account all of these factors, there's no end to the matter.
So let me, as a follow-up to that, and then I have a couple more to ask. It's a question of our mutual friend, Peter Pizzoli. As somebody who is aware of both our government's response to COVID and its management, and individuals' response of not feeling bound by the recommendations or even the requirement of masks, this is another quality of the psychospiritual. How do you, Elliot, as an individual, deal with your upset with the world around you in response to the COVID's failure to respond?
What should I say? Not well. Okay. Right. But better than some. I have a friend who he cannot stop talking about people, he walks for about an hour a day, people who are not wearing masks, or the mask is below their nose, or it's around their neck, and all that kind of, I mean, he vents every time I have a conversation with him, it's at least 10 or 15 minutes before he calms down so we can actually have a conversation. Also, some of our leadership, especially on the federal level, that has, first of all, denied the virus to begin with and said it's all going to pass and all of that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of rage about that, I must say. And, especially if you look at what has happened in some other countries where the leadership really has taken a very clear leadership role, and where they are not suffering nearly to the extent that we are, just in terms of percentages of people that have been infected, let alone the number of deaths that have occurred as a result of it. Another piece of this, by the way, is because I do a lot with healthcare. I've been as Rabbi Spitz said, I've been on the ethics committee at UCLA Medical Center since the 1980s. I've been on the ethics committee at the Jewish Home for the Aging since around that time. I've been on 3 federal commissions on issues of healthcare, and now I'm on the California Commission on ethics of stem cell research. So I mean, I do a lot of this stuff. We Americans, simply, what this pandemic has shown is that we really have a very, what shall I say, biased and inadequate healthcare system. We spend much more money than all of the other Western countries do on medical care, and we get much worse results. So even just simply on a fiscal basis, what we're doing in terms of how we deliver medical care makes no sense whatsoever. And what this pandemic has done is that it is, if anything, it has shown us the degree to which we really, many Americans do not have access to health care. And as a result, many Americans have pre-existing conditions. And as a result, and we really are not able to deliver the kind of health care that our neighbors to the north are, Canada and Israel and most Western European countries. That doesn't mean that every country has done it right. Sweden clearly did not do it right, but we didn't either. And so my rage is not just simply to those individuals who have been completely irresponsible, and thereby prolonging the pandemic, but also, frankly, to national leaders or to political leaders generally, some state governors as well, right, who have just pretended that this is not serious and it's just going to go away. I think we have to believe science.
So in that regard, Jody, one of our congregants asks, what's your response to guidelines which are the best we know now, but not necessarily correct or even deviate from the guidelines, which may end up later being the better?
Right. So one of the things that certainly the Jewish tradition teaches us is that we're not God, right? We're not omniscient. We don't know everything. So, and we can't be expected to know everything. So consequently, if you're asking, what is our duty in terms of taking care of our bodies, it is to do the best that we can with the knowledge that we have. And that may change over time, right? I mean, it was the case in the last half of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that a healthy body was a fat body. I mean, just look at all of the presidents that we had, toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, culminating with President Taft. But Cleveland was pretty heavy, and Grant was very heavy, and William Henry Harrison was very heavy, and right, and that was considered to be healthy, right? And now we know that it's not healthy to be overweight, let alone obese, right? Smoking, right? I'm old enough to remember when nobody knew what smoking did. It cut your wind. So if you were on one of the sports teams, you couldn't smoke when I was in high school, right? But otherwise, it was the cool thing to do, right? And then it turns out to be carcinogenic. And we never knew, that was 1964. And we never knew about secondhand smoke. That didn't come until much later. Now, I mean, so what are you going to do if let's say you have a grandparent that smoked and then died of lung cancer, and you say to yourself, why didn't he or she stop smoking? And some of it may just be, human foibles, but some of it is because people cannot really be held responsible for what the science of the time did not know. So what we do need to do, though, is try to take care of ourselves to the best that we know how. And that may turn out to be incorrect in months or years to come, but I think we still do have a duty to trust science to the extent that we have it to take care of ourselves. I mean, so let me put it the other way around. Wearing a mask will not kill you. Not wearing a mask might.
So just now we have too many questions to answer fully in the time left. Okay. So I'm going to try to honor different questions and know that however you'd like, I honor how you answer.
Go ahead.
On this topic, because the questions actually focus a good deal on the medical, which is appropriate because that is really where you stand above your peers in the rabbinic community. Arnold, a congregant shares that you have described seemingly triage as either or, as binary. Shouldn't there be a multi-point system based on multiple factors?
Yes, usually, as a matter of fact, that's exactly what happens. They're what called SOFA scores, which have to do with a whole series of medical indicators as to how healthy a person is or how not, right? So you have those kinds of, and by the way, even the SOFA scores are being criticized as being unfair to blacks because they use creatine instead of, it's a long story, but anyway. And then also, I mean, what you're talking about is questions about likelihood to survive to hospital discharge, and that involves a whole series of factors. No question about that. If it were easy, then I would not have weekly meetings for 2 hours with the ethics committee at UCLA Medical Center for 3 months, right? If it were really easy to create a triage policy that took into account all of the various factors that are relevant, then we would have done it in one meeting and be done with it. But you're absolutely right. There are many factors involved in this, and part of the issue is which ones do you take into account altogether? Do you, for example, prioritize pregnant women in their 8th or 9th month of pregnancy? And if you do you prioritize them over people who have dependents? So would you prioritize a pregnant woman over a woman who has a 5-year-old child and is a single mom, right? These things get really complicated really fast, right? And yes, there are multiple factors in this. Another way to do it is you ignore them all, and it's just first come, first serve. Or you ignore them all, and on any given day, whoever's there by 8 in the morning, you do a lottery, and that's the end of the matter, right? It's a question of that's exactly those are the conversations we're having.
So I have 2 more questions. I want Marcy and Wendy to know that those are the questions I'm getting to, and I'm going to stop it at that and then ask a closing question to pull it together. I'm not sure because there are many with this name. I hope Marcy, it's not your daughter Molly, who I adore, because you described a serious illness recently. And being in the hospital recently, she had the twofold problem of not really having ombudsman there to advocate for her medical needs and being isolated because of the COVID situation. So you were talking about people who need people. What is being done at UCLA and other places to meet that need on both counts?
Right.
Having somebody to help a young person get through the system who's an adult, but it's all new and they're compromised, and social.
Yeah. So the medical piece of this is COVID simply complicates what had been a hard thing to begin with. In other words, it still is the case that COVID notwithstanding, it still is the case that people have heart problems, they have lung problems, they need surgery of various sorts, right? They need a knee replacement, they need all kinds of things. They need to see their primary doctor, or they need to see their specialist, right? But now, in some places in this state, as well as in this country generally and elsewhere, the hospitals are overwhelmed, and you can't get an appointment to do these kinds of things, right? My wife has Parkinson's, and she has 2 electrodes in her head. She had deep brain stimulation surgery. She had that 4 years ago with a battery in her chest. Well, the battery in her chest stopped working, so it needed to be replaced, okay? Normally, that's a 10 or 15 minute operation once all the preparation takes place, right? And normally that would happen a week or 2 after it had done. We had to wait for 4 weeks before, and we just barely got an appointment. That was this morning, right? So when the hospital system is overwhelmed, then you have the problems that you're raising, namely, how do you get the kind of medical care that you need when in the face of people who are dying, right? Do you really need that knee replacement more than somebody who's dying needs the ventilator and needs that hospital bed, right? That's the kind of terrible calculation that has to happen these days, right? When normally, at least for people who have good health insurance, we're back to that again, right? At least for people who have good health insurance, you were able to get an appointment with your doctor and have things done in a reasonable amount of time. And then to add insult to injury, because COVID is so much of a communicable disease, hospitals are not allowing visitors. So the best you can do is Zoom again, or FaceTime, or something in that order, which you definitely should do, right? Again, it's not like being in the same room and hugging each other. It just isn't. Okay, back to Bialik. Okay, but it is. But the last thing that you should do is, if you have family or friends that are hospitalized or that are simply sick at home, the mitzvah of bikur cholim, of visiting the sick, is ever more important now than it ever was. It is always important, right? And it's because the rabbis understood that physical health and mental health and emotional health are all connected, that there is a commandment that in our tradition to visit the sick. Now you can't do that personally in many places, right? In many hospitals, or maybe even in homes, right? So, but do it, pick up the phone. It still works, okay? Or do FaceTime, or do Zoom. Do whatever you need to do in order to make these kinds of connections possible. And especially if you're talking about children, right? Who will feel really isolated and scared beyond belief. I mean, nurses do wonderful things. I've seen this, because I do a lot of medical ethics. Nurses tend to be wonderful people, really outgoing people who really try to help, and especially those that are in pediatric units, right? But they can only do so much, and a child really needs to see a familiar face.
So last question, and now I'm moving you from medical ethicist back to rabbi leading community. I'm combining Wendy's question and Jay, and that is Shabbat, high holidays, and looking forward of sacred time and Shabbat. What's your guidance to a synagogue on using technology to connect people now? And what do you think will be the impact of this gathering of community through technology on synagogues of the future?
Right. Well, now, remember I told you that conservative rabbis are across the board on exactly whether you can constitute a minyan on Zoom, and if so, for what purposes. I personally think, this is just Elliot Dorff talking now chair of the law committee, right? I personally think that this is indeed an emergency situation, and that we really do need each other now more than ever, and that so I would allow the use of electrical equipment to enable us to be together on weekdays, on Shabbat, and also on the high holidays. We're going to really, part of what the high holidays are all about for most of us is the whole community gets together. And even the Talmud saw that, the Rov Am Hadrat Melech, right? The Talmud says, with a multitude of people is the glory of the sovereign, glory of God, right? And we're not going to be able to do that this time, right? And this may be, Rosh Hashanah is Saturday and Sunday this year, so Saturday we would not be hearing the shofar anyway. But Sunday, what is the shofar? The blower of the shofar empties his or her lungs out, and the shofar spreads it all out, to everybody around, right? Normally that's fine, but this year, oh my God, right? So this may be the first Rosh Hashanah that you'll never hear the shofar, or you'll have a mask over it, at least that, something like that, and it'll be very muffled. But we need to do what we need to do. The hard question for me is the second one that you asked. What does this mean later on, right? Will people come to shul again, I certainly hope they do, because I think that being together in person has all kinds of meanings that being on a computer simply cannot have. We really do need community. We need to be able to talk to each other in person and see each other's body language and to understand each other. We need to be able to hug each other. We need to be able to argue with each other, right? We need to be able to, one of the things I miss most is, truthfully, is one of my shul buddies who sits next to me every Shabbat morning. And we daven, but we also talk. And and it's just, I was on the phone with him today, but it's just not the same thing. It's just not. So I really do hope that people will understand that once this is over, it is really important to come together again as a community for davening, for social things, for social action things, for educational things, all the things that synagogues do. But we may learn from this, though, some techniques for some things. It may be the case that some classes will be on Zoom because it's just easier to attend. You don't have to fight the traffic and things like that. It may be that some organizational meetings can be on Zoom. They don't have to be together in a room together, right? But and that's something that we're all going to have to sort of figure out. What really can be done electronically that we never thought of doing before, but now are forced to do this way, and what simply cannot be done this way. I taught my classes once the pandemic began from mid-March to mid-May, aside from Pesach, of course, online, and it's just not, it was okay. Some of, most of the content got transmitted, but it just, again, just not the same flavor.
I overlooked, normally I really am managing my time, but I do see a long question, and it resonates because I spoke to somebody who had the same question earlier today. So I'll ask it, give a short answer, and I'll pull this together. And that is, this is a very stressful time for all of us, and particularly for those people who have some pre-existing mental challenges, emotional challenges. It seems to exacerbate. And it's hard to find a therapist in a time where you can't meet a therapist in person. It's hard to know how to be motivated to care for yourself. So to somebody going through mental challenge, emotional challenge in this moment, what's your paragraph pastoral care? How does prayer impact? What's your guidance?
Okay, so first of all, if you try to get, I'm not a therapist, okay? So, and I certainly don't want to pretend to be one. I want to make that very clear, right? Through my work at Jewish Family Service, and I have one daughter who's a psychologist and another who's a social worker, so I have a lot of respect for that field. If you can't get to your usual therapist, call Jewish Family Service, see if they can help. Try to get somebody who really knows how to do this to help you with it. In addition to that, prayer is a form of reconnecting to the larger universe. Thanks to Gail, what you're not seeing in my background is my messy office. Maybe I'll do that at the end so you get the sense of reality. But what prayer does is it stops the treadmill, right? And it forces you to think about larger things. Why is there so much praise of God in the prayer book, right? By the way, that prayer is one of the things that Jews least understand. And in part, it's because we are misled by the very English word prayer. English is a Christian language. It was created by Christians. And so you shouldn't be surprised if a lot of words, especially religious words, have Christian connotations. Do this, I pray, means I beg, right? And so you think that prayer is all about asking for things. But then if you look at the Jewish prayer book, yes, there are some petitions in the middle of the Amidah, weekdays, right? But the vast majority of the prayer book is praising God and thanking God. Now, why is that the case? It's because what prayer is supposed to do is get you out of yourself. Me, myself, and I. Get you out of yourself and look at the world through God's eyes, right? And that will enable you to look at your life in a much broader context and to learn what's really important in your life and to learn how how to deal with whatever the challenges are. So prayer, I think, can be really important as a reservoir for the mental challenges that we have. Another kind of thing is if you cultivate friendships, and there are certain kinds of things you can talk with certain friends that you cannot talk with other friends about, right? But cultivate those kinds of things, and then also cultivate a taste for the arts of various sorts, right? Music can be real. I love music, so I'll just say it straight out. But music can be really calming. It can also be very, very uplifting. Sing along and don't worry about if anybody hears you, right? It's a way of singing gets literally you express, you press out of yourself a lot of the worries that you have, a lot of the anxiety that you have. Sing out loud, right? Remember that old, who was it? It was, the Carpenters. Sing out loud. Remember, sing out. Don't worry about if anybody. I'm going to get all the words wrong now here, but that's the point. I mean, I think singing is another way to deal with a lot of the anxiety that we have about this, and by the way, and a lot of the depression that we all have about this.
Well, I have less anxiety being with you and less despair. It is wonderful for this gift of your time, Elliot, to spend time with you as a community. You've been to CBI in person in recent years, and all the more where we as a community are sequestered and reaching out via Zoom. It's a treat to be in your home with you in your office. And
I'll see if we can get that back. I don't know how to do that.
You go back to next to stop video.
Yeah. And then I get video. Okay, video.
And then it'll say
mirror my video.
FaceTime HD camera, top one.
Top one.
The top of the choices on the
top of the choices. General. Video.
Yeah, the top one.
Camera,
HD.
Enable HD?
Yeah.
Okay. I still have that. Touch up my appearance? No, I don't want to do that. Hold on just a moment.
The FaceTime HD camera. You have FaceTime HD camera?
This way, spotlight my video when I speak. Always show video preview. Turn off my video when joining meeting.
No, don't do those.
Don't do those.
Next to the stop, next to select, it'll say select camera. When you click next to stop video, it'll say select a camera.
Yeah.
And then
camera Logitech Quick Cam Pro. Yeah.
Well,
widescreen, original ratio.
I think
enable HD.
Enable HD.
Okay, so I just did that.
Okay, we'll have to figure it out later.
Okay.
Click back to virtual background. Gail got you in and she's going to get you out.
She's going to get me out. Good.
Click back to virtual background.
So how do wait? So that thing next to stop the video, right? I click on the thing that's next to stop video, right? Okay, choose video. Well, choose virtual background.
Click back to virtual background and
then do none. There we are.
All right, we can say goodbye.
All right.
In your office at home, we can see what a man who's busy with thoughts, what that world looks like.
What can I tell you? From the cosmos to this.
As you say, back to reality. But
right, back to reality.
Yeah. Thank you for the reality, which is also a reality of shared time with you, which is a sweet aspect of this moment. So thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Professor Dorff. It's
my
great
pleasure
to be illuminated.
Okay, my pleasure.
All right.
Be well, people. Okay.
Be well. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.